plains of Afghanistan when we armed these mujahideen fighters, one lesson we learned then was that arming insurgencies can be very effective in bringing about world peace. But at the same time, it doesn't stop right there.
As the Mujahideen emerged from the Holy War in Afghanistan, they saw an unholy war taking place in the Gulf. This was to prove the turning point for Osama bin Laden, who'd come out of the Afghan jihad with a reputation for some as a leader. The West were accused of having supported Saddam Hussein when Iraq had gone to war with the Ayatollah's Iran 10 years earlier. But it was the West that the Saudis turned to for help when Saddam invaded Kuwait. To the Mujahideen, who saw themselves as the moral and military guardians of the Muslim world, this was the ultimate betrayal.
Britain, Western Europe and America had armed, financed and created the bogeyman himself, Saddam Hussein. Saudi Arabia supplied him with $20 billion of aid and Kuwait with over $40 billion of aid during the war against Iran that killed 1 million of his own people and over 1 million Iranians. And then suddenly we're supposed to believe he's the bogeyman and this new Hitler in the Middle East who's going to take over the oil wells.
To the Mujahideen, it was the West who were taking over the Holy Land. The sacred sites of Islam lie in Saudi Arabia, and access is forbidden to non-Muslims. 10 years after the liberation of Kuwait, thousands of foreign troops are still there, and this has become an explosive issue.
Why are they still there? They're there to defend the oil fields, to make sure that until they're bled dry, nobody else threatens them.
Osama bin Laden accused the Saudi government of colluding with the West at the expense of the Islamic world. They responded by stripping him of his native citizenship in 1994. 4 years later, now an international fugitive, he announced the creation of the Islamic Front for Jihad. This was an international coalition of radical groups from various countries. The aim was to establish an Islamic state. The obstacle standing in the way was the West, and what they saw as corrupt Muslim governments. The solution was jihad. In the 90s, this was to become an offensive rather than a defensive struggle, as bin Laden issued a fatwa against the United States.
They have made the United States their adversary precisely because of what we stand for and what we stand against. A few months ago, and again this week, bin Laden publicly vowed to wage a terrorist war against America, saying, and I quote, "We do not differentiate between those dressed in military uniforms and civilians. They're all targets. Their mission is murder, and their history is bloody."
To Muslims who condemn Osama bin Laden's interpretation of jihad, their religion is being used to excuse the inexcusable. To the West, like the Ayatollah Khomeini before him, he has come to embody the fear of Islam.
In Islam, terrorism is not allowed. In Islam, jihad is allowed to fight oppression. Jihad is allowed to fight a particular cause. Jihad is allowed to fight your own internal yourself against any criminal activity that you may be involved with. But to target and terrorize any community in the name of Islam is totally wrong, and it has to be differentiated and separated from the word jihad. A terrorist is a terrorist, and it cannot be mixed with jihad.
But the distinction between jihad and terrorism became blurred in the 1990s, as some Muslims became increasingly radical in the name of religion. Although jihad movements have existed for centuries, the Afghan war added a new dimension. The most significant uprisings and attacks throughout the last decade have been linked, either directly or indirectly, to the Afghan war veterans. It is claimed that using the skills acquired during that war, Osama bin Laden launched a jihad movement that covered the globe. Some of the Afghan war veterans went on to defend what they saw as oppressed Muslims in other parts of the world: Kashmir, Sudan, Somalia, Chechnya, Bosnia, as jihad went global. Some returned to their own countries to spearhead violent struggles against what they saw as Western-backed corrupt regimes in places like Egypt and Algeria. And some went to war with the West itself, particularly America, the world's only remaining superpower. The World Trade Center in New York was bombed in 1993. America had been hit by an international terrorist attack on its own soil for the first time.
In recent years, they killed American, Belgian, and Pakistani peacekeepers in Somalia. They plotted to assassinate the President of Egypt and the Pope. They planned to bomb 6 United States 747s over the Pacific. They bombed the Egyptian embassy in Pakistan. They gunned down German tourists in Egypt. The most recent terrorist events are fresh in our memory.
In 1998, on the 8th anniversary of the entry of US troops in the Gulf, American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, were bombed, killing 224 people and injuring 5,000. Osama bin Laden denied responsibility, but admitted he admired those that had carried out the attacks.
We now seem to be moving into a phase in which the terrorists are ideological. They're out there to do something to damage the United States. We are out there as a very obvious, visible target for people who want to run regimes with no human rights, with no liberty, with no democracy. It's a struggle that's going to go on, and we're going to win.
In order to win, America focused on Osama bin Laden and targeted states accused of protecting him by launching 75 cruise missiles at Afghanistan and Sudan. The missile attack on Afghanistan killed 24 people, but missed bin Laden. The bombing of the Al-Shifa plant in Sudan was contentious. American officials claimed it produced chemical weapons and was linked to Osama bin Laden. The Sudanese, led by their president, took to the streets protesting it produced 90% of Sudan's much-needed medical supplies. The American assault on 2 of the poorest Muslim countries in the world was condemned by many.
You will see the consequences over years, which then creates this anxiety and, of course, hatred within the popular movements within these Muslim countries, and really brings instability in other countries to say, well, look at the United States, the way it behaves. You know, it really behaves in a way like a world gangster is behaving.
A few more failed attacks like the attack on Khartoum, you know, in a number of other areas where maybe more lives are lost illegitimately, can in fact feed anti-Westernism and anti-Americanism and legitimate what many terrorists will say about a West that is anti-Islamic.
USA, you will pay! USA, you will pay! Jihad is on its way!
Protests against the American bombing were also seen on the streets of London as the influence of a global Islamic struggle hit home. Britain has traditionally given asylum to political dissidents. Some are using these liberal freedoms to speak out against foreign regimes that they see as oppressive, and this now includes America.
For any serious political opposition or somebody who wants to continue influencing politics in the Muslim world and wants, for one reason or another, cannot live in their country, to come